Why is this taking so long?
For the murder of the victim and her unborn child, this court sentences you to life in prison.
14-year-old Mara Morrison murdered her pregnant mother, Jennifer Morrison, by striking her from behind with a decorative lighthouse statue during a baby shower, causing her to fall onto rocks below the deck of their rented beach house. The impact killed both Jennifer and her unborn son, whom the family had planned to name Ethan. What began as a celebration quickly transformed into a crime scene that would shock the island community and spark a nationwide conversation about juvenile justice. Before we continue with this tragic story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we explore this disturbing case of familial betrayal and teenage violence. The Morrison family had chosen the remote beach house on Long Key specifically for its isolation and stunning ocean views, hoping the getaway would strengthen family bonds before the baby arrived. The two-story rental stood on stilts, its wide wooden deck extending toward the shoreline where jagged rocks lined the beach instead of sand, a feature the owners had warned could be dangerous, especially at high tide. Jennifer, 7 months pregnant and glowing with excitement, had spent weeks planning the intimate baby shower, inviting only close family members to the weekend celebration in the pastel-colored home, perched between the turquoise waters of the Atlantic and the thin strip of Highway 1 connecting the islands. Inside the beach house, the scene was picture perfect. Blue and white decorations adorned the living room, tiny sailboats served as centerpieces, and a handmade "Welcome Baby Ethan" banner hung across the stone fireplace, where a decorative lighthouse statue stood prominently on the mantel. Jennifer's sister had organized games and catered food for the dozen guests who filled the open-concept main floor with laughter and conversation. No one noticed Mara sitting silently in the corner of the room, her expression darkening with each gift her mother unwrapped, each tiny outfit, each stuffed animal, each item that represented the life about to change forever. As the evening sun began to set, casting golden-orange light across the water, Jennifer excused herself from the festivities around 6:30 p.m., stepping onto the deck for some fresh air. Security camera footage from a neighboring property would later show Mara following her mother outside moments later, her hands empty as she approached, then returning inside alone approximately 4 minutes later. The footage, grainy but distinct enough to identify figures, captured no one else on the deck during that time frame. Just a mother and daughter, then only the daughter returning, closing the sliding glass door behind her. Inside, as family members continued opening gifts and serving cake, no one questioned Jennifer's absence for nearly 2 hours. When asked, Mara calmly told her father and relatives that her mother had mentioned wanting to take a walk on the beach to stretch her legs. Her performance was convincing. She even cut a slice of cake for her mother, setting it aside for when she returned, an act of calculated normalcy that would later chill investigators to their core. The sun had fully set by 8:45 p.m. when David Morrison, growing concerned about his wife's extended absence, grabbed a flashlight and headed outside to search for her. The Florida Keys evening had turned cool, with a gentle breeze coming off the water and the distant sound of boats returning to harbor for the night. David called Jennifer's name repeatedly as he scanned the property with his flashlight beam, first checking the parking area, then the small garden, before finally directing the light toward the rocky shoreline below the deck. What David discovered would forever alter the trajectory of his life. Jennifer's body sprawled awkwardly on the rocks, her blue maternity dress darkened with blood, her limbs at unnatural angles. His anguished scream brought family members rushing outside as he scrambled down the wooden stairs to reach his wife, desperately checking for a pulse he wouldn't find. Someone called 911, while others tried to keep Mara away from the scene, not yet suspecting she was responsible for the tragedy unfolding before them. First responders arrived within minutes, the flashing lights of ambulances and police cruisers illuminating the isolated beach house in pulses of red and blue. Paramedics confirmed what David already knew: Jennifer was dead, and there was nothing they could do for her or the unborn baby. The Monroe County Sheriff's Department quickly secured the area, initially treating it as a tragic accident, a pregnant woman who had fallen from the deck in the growing darkness, a horrible misfortune on what should have been a joyous occasion. As family members gave preliminary statements, Mara maintained her composure, repeating her story about her mother going for a walk. She spoke quietly but clearly, her expression appropriately sad, but notably lacking in the kind of emotional devastation displayed by her father and other relatives. Deputies noted her unusual calmness, but attributed it to shock, a common reaction to sudden tragedy, especially in adolescents who might not fully process the permanence of death. Medical examiner Dr. Raymond Garcia arrived shortly before midnight, conducting a preliminary examination of Jennifer's body, where it lay on the rocks. He immediately noted something odd. The primary head wound appeared inconsistent with a simple fall. The injury showed signs of being caused by a direct impact with a solid object before any secondary trauma from hitting the rocks below. This observation would transform the case from a tragic accident to a suspicious death investigation by morning. As crime scene technicians photographed the area and collected evidence throughout the night, family members were moved to a nearby hotel. David held his daughter close, both of them wrapped in the surreal fog of grief, unaware that the physical proximity would be their last moments of normalcy. Mara leaned into her father's embrace, her face buried in his shoulder, hiding an expression that might have revealed the truth to those around her. The beach house, once filled with celebration, became eerily silent as investigators worked methodically through the night under portable lights. The decorative lighthouse statue sitting innocently on the mantelpiece would not draw their attention until morning, when a more thorough examination of the house would begin. For now, it remained in place, its white ceramic surface appearing clean and undisturbed, betraying nothing of the role it had played in the evening's violence. Jennifer Morrison was more than just a statistic or a headline. She was a vibrant 32-year-old woman whose life had touched countless others in the Florida Keys community of Marathon, where the family had made their home 5 years earlier. A dedicated elementary school teacher specializing in third grade, she was known for creating innovative science lessons that took advantage of the unique island ecosystem surrounding them. Her classroom at Marathon Elementary featured an elaborate touch tank where students could interact with local marine life, a project that had won district recognition and inspired similar programs throughout Monroe County schools. Friends and colleagues described Jennifer as patient, creative, and genuinely devoted to her students, particularly those struggling with difficult home situations. Her principal would later tell reporters that Jennifer often arrived early and stayed late, creating individualized learning materials for children who needed extra support. She volunteered to coordinate the school's annual beach cleanup, turning it into an educational event about marine conservation that drew participation from across the Keys community, connecting the isolated island chain through shared environmental stewardship. Behind Jennifer's professional accomplishments lay a personal journey marked by both joy and profound challenge. She and David had met in college at the University of Miami, where she studied education and he pursued marine biology, their shared love of the ocean creating an immediate bond. They married young, at 23, and immediately began trying to start a family, a dream that would prove heartbreakingly elusive for nearly a decade. Their path to parenthood had been marked by 4 devastating miscarriages over 8 years, each loss driving deeper the stakes of Jennifer's current pregnancy. Medical records would reveal a history of fertility treatments, specialists' appointments, and eventually the successful intervention that had allowed her to carry Ethan past the critical first trimester. The nursery plans found in her journal detailed not just decoration ideas but hopes and dreams for a child she had fought desperately to bring into the world. What made Jennifer's murder particularly tragic was the timing. After years of disappointment, she had finally reached what doctors considered a safe point in her pregnancy. The baby shower was meant to be a celebration, not just of the impending birth, but of overcoming the heartbreak that had preceded it. Ethan, at 7 months gestation, had been active and healthy, his ultrasound images proudly displayed during the shower on a special memory board that Jennifer had created. David Morrison, in his witness statement, described how Jennifer had been glowing with happiness during the party, excitedly showing guests the 3D ultrasound pictures where Ethan's features were clearly visible. "She kept saying he had my nose and her chin," David recalled, his voice breaking as he spoke to detectives. "She had spent the whole week before the party setting up the perfect nursery surprise for me. I didn't know she had finished painting it with an ocean theme that matched that damn lighthouse statue." The lighthouse statue that would become the murder weapon had been a housewarming gift from Jennifer's sister when the Morrisons purchased their Florida Keys home, a symbolic beacon representing their new start in the island community. The ceramic piece stood about 14 inches tall, heavy enough to cause significant damage when wielded with force, its base providing a convenient handle for someone intent on using it as a weapon. Jennifer had given it a place of honor on their mantel, and when planning the baby shower, she had specifically requested it be brought to the rental house to make the temporary space feel more like home. What the adults in Jennifer's life hadn't fully recognized were the undercurrents of tension between mother and daughter. While Jennifer's attention had naturally shifted toward her pregnancy, after years of trying, Mara had interpreted this as abandonment, a perception that would fester into resentment and ultimately violence. Jennifer's phone contained dozens of unanswered text messages to Mara in the months leading up to the murder, invitations to help prepare the nursery, suggestions for sister-brother activities after the birth, attempts to include her daughter in the pregnancy journey that went largely ignored. Jennifer's journal, recovered from her luggage at the beach house, revealed her growing concern about Mara's withdrawal. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the murder, read, "Tried again to get Mara involved in planning for Ethan's arrival. She barely looked up from her phone. David says it's just normal teenage stuff, but it feels like something more. I've signed us up for mother-daughter pottery class next month, hoping it might give us a chance to reconnect before the baby comes." Another entry, written the night before the baby shower, showed Jennifer's excitement tempered with concern. "Everything is ready for tomorrow. The decorations look perfect, and I can't wait to celebrate with everyone. I'm still worried." About Mara, though. She hardly spoke during the drive here, and when I showed her the baby clothes I bought yesterday, she just shrugged and walked away. David thinks the boarding school brochures upset her, but we've explained it's just an option for better academic opportunities, not something we're forcing on her. I hope she understands this baby isn't replacing her. There's room in our hearts for both our children. That last journal entry would prove tragically prophetic, revealing that Jennifer had been aware of her daughter's misinterpretation of the boarding school discussion, but had not grasped the depth of Mara's distortion. The misunderstanding that the parents viewed as minor would become, in Mara's mind, evidence of their plan to discard her in favor of their new child, a perceived betrayal that would lead to murder mere hours after Jennifer wrote those words. The autopsy would later reveal that Jennifer died not from the fall onto the rocks, but from the initial blow to the head from the lighthouse statue. Dr. Raymond Garcia determined that the skull fracture occurred before impact with the ground, meaning Jennifer was likely unconscious or already dying when she fell from the deck. This crucial detail would become central to the prosecution's case that her death was not an accident, but a deliberate act of violence, perpetrated by her own daughter. The 911 call came in at 8:47 p.m., David Morrison's voice breaking as he frantically reported finding his wife's body on the rocks beneath their rented beach house deck. "Please help! My wife is hurt. She's fallen. She's pregnant. Please hurry!" The dispatcher kept him on the line, listening to his ragged breathing and fragmented descriptions as first responders raced toward the remote property along the narrow overseas highway that threads through the Florida Keys. The call, later played in court, captured the raw moment of discovery, a husband's world shattering in real time, unaware that the true nature of the tragedy was even more horrific than he imagined. Monroe County Sheriff's deputies, Aaron Jimenez and Sofia Torres, arrived first, finding the beach house illuminated, and family members gathered on the deck, several of them hysterical as they pointed flashlights toward the rocks below. Deputy Torres immediately secured the scene while Deputy Jimenez made his way down to where David knelt beside his wife's body, already knowing from the unnatural position and visible blood that they were dealing with a fatality. The responding officers' body cameras captured the chaotic scene, the rocky shoreline slick with seawater, Jennifer's blue dress billowing slightly in the breeze, and David having to be physically restrained from continuing to attempt resuscitation long after it was futile. Detective Nathan Sanders arrived 30 minutes later, by which time the initial assumption among first responders was that they were dealing with a tragic accident, a pregnant woman who had ventured onto the deck alone and somehow fallen over the railing. The detective's first observations, meticulously recorded in his case notes, included the height of the deck railing, 42 inches, well above standard safety requirements, the absence of any obvious structural failures, and the clear weather conditions with only light winds. Nothing about the scene immediately suggested foul play, he would later testify, but standard protocol required treating any unattended death as suspicious until proven otherwise. While paramedics officially pronounced Jennifer and her unborn child deceased at the scene, Detective Sanders conducted preliminary interviews with family members inside the beach house, separating witnesses to get independent accounts. The pattern that emerged from these early statements seemed consistent. Jennifer had excused herself from the gathering around 6:30 p.m., presumably to get some fresh air, and when she hadn't returned after some time, family members assumed she was taking a walk on the beach. No one reported hearing any unusual sounds, screams, or commotion from the deck area. Mara Morrison, interviewed separately from the adults, presented as calm and cooperative, maintaining direct eye contact with the detective as she recounted seeing her mother step outside. She said she needed some air and was going to walk on the beach for a while, Mara stated, her voice steady. "I didn't think anything of it. Mom does that sometimes when she gets tired of being around a lot of people." When asked if she had gone outside at any point herself, Mara hesitated briefly before answering no, the first inconsistency that would later gain significance when the neighboring security footage was discovered. The discovery of the foundational clue came during the early morning hours when crime scene technicians began processing the interior of the beach house. Investigator Melissa Chen was photographing the living room when she noticed something unusual about the decorative lighthouse statue on the mantelpiece. While the surface appeared clean, the base showed subtle smudge marks consistent with recent handling. On closer inspection, under specialized lighting, she detected what appeared to be microscopic spatter on the backside of the statue, nearly invisible to the naked eye but suggestive of blood that had been hastily cleaned. "I've processed enough crime scenes to recognize when something's been wiped down," Investigator Chen would later testify. The statue was too clean compared to the other decorative items around it, which all had a normal layer of dust. Following protocol, she carefully bagged the lighthouse statue for laboratory analysis, making a specific note about the possibility of blood evidence and fingerprints beneath a cleaned surface. This careful observation would ultimately become the case's turning point, transforming a presumed accident into a homicide investigation. By dawn on July 15th, Jennifer's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office in Key West, and the investigation had shifted dramatically based on Dr. Raymond Garcia's preliminary findings. His early morning call to Detective Sanders changed the trajectory of the case. The primary head injury is inconsistent with a fall. The wound pattern suggests she was struck from behind with significant force by a solid object with a defined edge before she ever hit the rocks. This is no accident, detective. You're looking at a homicide. Armed with this information, Sanders expanded the investigation, ordering a canvass of neighboring properties to locate any potential witnesses or security cameras. The Florida Keys, with its mix of luxury vacation homes and modest permanent residences, presented a challenge. Many properties stood empty during the off-season, and others were occupied by tourists who had already checked out and departed. The breakthrough came from a retired couple 3 houses down who mentioned their security system with cameras covering the waterfront side of their property, which incidentally captured a partial view of the Morrisons' rental deck. The security footage, retrieved by late afternoon, provided the damning evidence investigators needed. The grainy but clear video showed Jennifer stepping onto the deck at 6:28 p.m., followed approximately 1 minute later by Mara. There was no audio, but the body language captured was telling. Jennifer standing at the railing looking out at the water, seemingly unaware of her daughter's approach from behind. At 6:32 p.m., the footage showed Mara returning inside alone, closing the sliding glass door behind her. No one else appeared on the deck during this time frame, and Jennifer was never seen walking down to the beach as Mara had claimed. Back at the beach house, now fully processed as a crime scene, technicians had discovered additional evidence supporting the homicide theory. Luminol testing revealed traces of blood spatter on the deck that had been washed away, likely by seawater from a garden hose, found nearby with its valve recently turned on, according to moisture readings. The railing showed no signs of damage or stress that would suggest Jennifer had accidentally fallen over it, and the height made an accidental fall highly implausible for someone of her stature without some significant force being involved. By the evening of July 15th, just 24 hours after Jennifer's death, Detective Sanders had assembled enough evidence to justify treating Mara as a suspect rather than merely a witness. However, he strategically decided not to immediately confront the teenager, instead allowing her to continue believing the investigation was focused on an accidental fall. This approach, he would explain in his case notes, was intended to prevent Mara from developing a more sophisticated defense before all forensic results were available. "We need the lab analysis of the statue before we question her further," Sanders wrote in his case. "File. If her fingerprints are under the cleaned blood, as we suspect, combined with the security footage contradicting her statement, we'll have enough to break through any denials." This methodical building of the case, prioritizing forensic evidence over confrontation, would ultimately prove critical in securing a confession from a suspect who had already demonstrated remarkable composure in the face of questioning. While investigators awaited the forensic results, they continued gathering background information that might suggest a motive. Interviews with extended family members revealed the first hints of tension between mother and daughter. Jennifer's sister mentioned noticing Mara's apparent disinterest in the baby shower activities, describing her niece as sullen and withdrawn throughout the celebration. David's brother recalled overhearing Mara make a dismissive comment when Jennifer was opening gifts, something along the lines of, "Great, more stuff," for the replacement kid. These comments prompted Detective Sanders to obtain a warrant to search Mara's belongings at the beach house, where investigators discovered a journal hidden in the lining of her suitcase. The entries painted a disturbing picture of a teenager who felt increasingly marginalized in her own family, with recent entries focusing obsessively on the pregnancy and perceived changes in her parents' behavior toward her. One entry, dated just a week before the murder, would later be read aloud in court. "They think I don't know what they're planning, but I heard them talking about boarding school again last night. They need my room for the baby, need me gone so they can have their perfect new family without the reminder of their screwed-up first attempt at parenting." The morning of July 16th brought the first definitive forensic results that transformed suspicion into certainty for the investigative team working the Morrison case. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement's mobile lab, dispatched to the Keys due to the high-profile nature of the case, confirmed what investigator Chen had suspected. The decorative lighthouse statue had indeed been recently cleaned, but not thoroughly enough to eliminate all evidence. Under specialized lighting and chemical processing, technicians revealed faint but unmistakable blood residue in the crevices of the decorative piece, particularly around the base and the textured rocks at the bottom of the lighthouse design. "We're dealing with a hasty cleanup job," the lab technician explained to Detective Sanders as they examined the results. "Whoever did this was in a hurry, likely using just water and maybe some quick wiping with a towel. They got the visible blood but missed the microscopic spatter that seeped into the ceramic's porous surface." The blood matched Jennifer Morrison's type, and preliminary DNA testing strongly suggested it was hers, though full confirmation would take additional days of processing at the main lab in Tallahassee. More damning still was the discovery of fingerprints beneath the cleaned surface, partial smudged prints that the technicians isolated using specialized techniques designed to detect latent impressions beneath substances that have been wiped away. The preliminary match to Mara's prints, taken as part of routine elimination prints from family members, provided the physical connection investigators needed. "The placement of these prints is crucial," Detective Sanders noted in his case file. "They're positioned exactly where someone would grip the statue to swing it as a weapon, and they're under the cleaned blood, meaning they were deposited before the blood and before the cleaning attempt." The security footage from the neighboring beach house, enhanced by FDLE technicians, yielded additional details that further implicated Mara. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed that when she followed her mother onto the deck, her right hand appeared to be concealing something behind her back, something approximately the size and shape of the lighthouse statue, though the grainy quality and angle of the camera made absolute identification impossible. What was clear, however, was the timing. Mara emerged from the house approximately 4 minutes after following her mother outside, and Jennifer was never seen again on any footage. As these pieces came together, Detective Sanders assembled a timeline that left little room for alternative explanations. Jennifer had stepped onto the deck at 6:28 p.m. Mara had followed at 6:29 p.m., possibly already carrying the lighthouse statue, though when and how she retrieved it remained unclear. By 6:32 p.m., Mara had returned inside alone, closed the door, and, according to family members, resumed her position at the party as if nothing had happened. Given the medical examiner's determination that Jennifer died from blunt force trauma before falling to the rocks below, the window for the attack was narrowed to those critical minutes caught on camera. The isolated location of the beach house had initially seemed like a challenge for investigators, but ultimately proved advantageous in eliminating other potential suspects. The nearest public beach access was over a mile away, and the neighboring properties were either unoccupied or had residents who could account for their whereabouts. The rocky shoreline below the deck was not easily accessible from the water due to shallow reefs, making an approach by boat highly unlikely without being noticed. The security footage showing no other individuals on the deck during the critical time frame effectively closed the circle around Mara. Further evidence emerged when detectives interviewed the rental property's cleaning service, which had prepared the beach house for the Morrisons' arrival. The head cleaner confirmed that the lighthouse statue had not been part of the rental's decor. It had been brought by the family. This information contradicted Maura's claim during her initial interview that she never touched that lighthouse thing because she didn't want to break the rental's stuff. This minor but telling inconsistency suggested Maura was constructing a narrative to distance herself from the object that forensics now tied directly to the crime. While the physical evidence was accumulating, Detective Sanders assigned a team to dig deeper into Maura's background, searching for any history that might help explain such an extreme act of violence. School records painted a picture of a once promising student whose academic performance had declined sharply in recent months, coinciding with Jennifer's advancing pregnancy. Teachers described Maura as increasingly withdrawn in class, and the school counselor revealed having several sessions with the teenager about adjustment issues related to family changes, though nothing that had raised serious red flags about potential violence. Maura's online presence revealed more troubling indicators. Her social media accounts, accessed via warrant, showed a pattern of increasingly dark content, following true crime stories, researching famous cases of familicide, and engaging with content about unwanted siblings and family betrayal. Her search history in the weeks leading up to the murder included queries like how to get parents to change their mind about boarding school, can minors refuse to go to boarding school, and most disturbing, accidental false statistics, pregnant women. 3 days after Jennifer's death, as Maura continued to live with relatives under the pretense that she was simply a grieving daughter, Detective Sanders received the final forensic confirmation he needed. The DNA analysis conclusively identified the blood on the lighthouse statue as Jennifer's, and the fingerprint analysis showed a definitive match to Maura's prints in multiple locations on the statue, including positions consistent with gripping it as a weapon. With this evidence in hand, he obtained an arrest warrant for Maura Morrison on charges of first-degree murder. The decision to arrest a 14-year-old for the murder of her mother was not taken lightly. Sanders consulted with the Monroe County District Attorney's Office, juvenile authorities, and psychological experts before proceeding. The consensus was clear: the premeditated nature of the act, as evidenced by the online searches and journal entries, combined with the attempted cleanup and calculated deception afterward, justified treating the case as an adult homicide rather than a juvenile matter. Florida law permitted such prosecutorial discretion in cases of extreme violence, regardless of the perpetrator's age. On the morning of July the 17th, 3 days after Jennifer's murder, Detective Sanders and 2 uniformed deputies arrived at the home of Jennifer's sister, where Maura had been staying since the night of the incident. They found her sitting in the backyard, scrolling through her phone with apparent disinterest in the activity. Around her, family members making funeral arrangements for her mother and unborn brother. The arrest was conducted quietly, away from media attention, with Sanders informing Maura of her rights in the presence of her aunt, who collapsed in shock as she realized what was happening. Maura showed little reaction to the arrest itself, maintaining the same eerie composure she had displayed since her mother's death. It was only when Sanders informed her they were charging her as an adult that a flash of emotion, something between fear and anger, crossed her face. "You can't do that," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm only 14. This brief moment of protest would be her only display of concern during the arrest process, after which she retreated back into a state of detached compliance as she was transported to the juvenile holding facility in Key West. The news of the arrest spread quickly through the close-knit Florida Keys community, leaving neighbors and acquaintances struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet teenager they knew with the calculated killer described in the charging documents. Local media converged on the courthouse where Maura would make her first appearance, the story's shocking elements: a pregnant mother killed by her teenage daughter during a baby shower, guaranteeing national attention that would soon transform the case into a lightning rod for discussions about juvenile justice, family dynamics, and the psychological impact of sibling displacement. In the fluorescent-lit evidence room of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, Detective Nathan Sanders methodically arranged the pieces of his case against Maura Morrison on a large corkboard, connecting them with red string and a visual representation of the narrative he would present to prosecutors. At the center was a photograph of the lighthouse statue, now the most crucial physical evidence linking the teenager to her mother's murder. Around it, he positioned crime scene photos, the security camera stills, laboratory reports, and excerpts from Maura's journal, a constellation of evidence that, taken together, told the story of a calculated act of violence born from months of festering resentment. The lighthouse statue had yielded even more evidence under advanced forensic analysis than initially expected. Beyond the blood and fingerprints, technicians had discovered microscopic fragments of Jennifer's hair embedded in the decorative ridges of the ceramic piece, consistent with a powerful swinging impact to the back of her head. The pattern of these fragments matched precisely with the wound documented in Jennifer's autopsy, creating an irrefutable connection between the object and the fatal injury. What makes this evidence particularly compelling, forensic technician Melissa Chen explained in her report, is the layering we've been able to document. Maura's fingerprints are the bottom layer, followed by the blood and hair from Jennifer, with smudge patterns from cleaning attempts as the top layer. This sequencing tells the story of the object being handled by Maura, used to strike Jennifer, and then hastily cleaned before being replaced. This chronological evidence would become central to the prosecution's case, establishing not just opportunity, but deliberate action and attempted concealment. The medical examiner's final report provided additional details that strengthened the case against Maura. Dr. Raymond Garcia determined that Jennifer had been struck with significant force from behind, the blow landing at the base of her skull with enough impact to cause immediate unconsciousness and likely death within minutes, regardless of the subsequent fall. The pattern and depth of the skull fracture is consistent with a powerful swing of the lighthouse statue, his report stated. The victim would have had no warning, no opportunity to defend herself or brace for impact. Further analysis of Jennifer's injuries revealed defensive wounds on her hands or signs of a struggle, suggesting she had been completely unaware of the danger behind her. The positioning of her body on the rocks below, while initially appearing consistent with an accidental fall, revealed subtle inconsistencies when examined by forensic specialists. The distribution of blood spatter on the deck railing indicated Jennifer was already bleeding profusely before going over the edge, contradicting any scenario where the head injury resulted from the fall itself. The timeline established by investigators revealed the calculated nature of Maura's actions. Security footage showed her watching her mother open baby gifts for approximately an hour before the murder, her expression growing increasingly tense, according to witness statements. At some point before following Jennifer outside, Maura would have needed to retrieve the lighthouse statue from the mantel, an action no witnesses recalled seeing, suggesting she had either done so discreetly or had planned ahead, positioning herself near the object as the opportunity arose. After the attack, the evidence indicated Maura had acted with remarkable composure. She had quickly cleaned the statue, returned it to its place on the mantel, and rejoined the party without raising suspicions. Family members recalled her calmly eating cake, participating in conversations, and even helping to clean up gift wrapping during the nearly 2-hour period when Jennifer's absence went from unremarkable to concerning. This behavior, prosecutors would later argue, demonstrated not the panic of a teenager after an impulsive act, but the calculated deception of someone attempting to establish an alibi. As detectives dug deeper into the family dynamics, the motive for the murder emerged with increasing clarity. interviews with extended family members revealed that Jennifer and David had indeed been considering several boarding schools for Maura, but not, as she had believed, to make room for the baby. School brochures found in the Morrisons' home office showed prestigious institutions known for their strong science programs, aligning with Maura's previously expressed interest in marine biology, the same field her father had pursued. They thought they were giving her an opportunity, Jennifer's sister told investigators through tears. Jen was so excited about finding schools with strong science programs where Maura could really thrive. She talked about how Maura had seemed less happy at her current school lately, more withdrawn. They thought a change of environment might help her come out of her shell again. This explanation, corroborated by emails between Jennifer and the schools inquiring about scholarship opportunities, painted a very different picture than the abandonment narrative Maura had constructed in her mind. The journal discovered in Maura's suitcase provided the most direct window into her distorted perception of events. Entries spanning the previous 6 months showed an escalating sense of betrayal and resentment, with the boarding school discussion serving as confirmation of her worst fears rather than the opportunity her parents had intended. "They've been planning it for months," one entry read. "First the new baby to replace me, then shipping me off to boarding school so they don't have to look at their failed first attempt at parenting anymore. Mom talks about the baby constantly but barely asks about my life anymore. It's like I'm already gone to her." Mental health experts consulted by the prosecution found these entries particularly revealing. "What we're seeing is catastrophic thinking and extreme personalization," forensic psychologist Dr. Samantha Weiss noted in her assessment. Rather than perceiving the boarding school discussion as being about educational opportunity, Maura interpreted it through the lens of abandonment and replacement. This distortion appears to have intensified as the pregnancy progressed, creating a feedback loop where normal parental excitement about a new baby was perceived as evidence of being discarded. Perhaps most chilling to investigators was an entry dated just 2 days before the murder, after the family had arrived at the beach house for the baby shower weekend. "Everyone's making such a big deal about precious baby Ethan. Mom spent an hour showing everyone his ultrasound pictures today. No one even noticed when I left the room. They're all so excited about the baby, they have no idea how different things are going to be after this weekend." This entry, with its ominous foreshadowing of the violence to come, suggested a degree of premeditation that would support the first-degree murder charges prosecutors intended to pursue. While Maura's defense would later argue that the attack was an impulsive act triggered by the emotional stress of the baby shower, the journal entries indicated she had been contemplating some form of dramatic action for days or possibly weeks before the actual murder. Beyond the forensic evidence and documented motive, prosecutors were building a psychological profile of Maura that would help explain how a teenager with no prior history of violence could commit such a brutal act against her own mother. They noted the calculated nature of her actions immediately following the murder, the cleaning of the weapon, the calm rejoining of the party, the fabricated story about her mother taking a walk, as indicators of an unsettling emotional detachment that would become central to their portrayal of her at trial. By the time Detective Sanders presented his completed case file to the district attorney's office 1 week after Jennifer's death, the evidence against Maura was overwhelming. Physical evidence connected her directly to the murder weapon. Security footage placed her at the scene during the narrow window when the attack occurred. Her own writings provided clear documentation of motive and intent. And her behavior before, during, and after the crime demonstrated a level of calculation that belied any claim of momentary impulse or diminished capacity. "In my 22 years of law enforcement," Sanders wrote in his final case summary, "I have rarely encountered a case where the physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and psychological motivation align so completely. The lighthouse statue that Mara Morrison attempted to clean and return to its place tells the story her words tried to conceal, a story of premeditated violence born from a profound misinterpretation of her parents' intentions, with tragic consequences for an entire family. This assessment would form the foundation for what prosecutors now prepared to present in court, as the case against Mara Morrison moved toward a trial that would captivate the nation's attention. The juvenile holding facility in Key West, with its mint green walls and reinforced windows, provided a stark contrast to the luxurious beach house where Mara Morrison had spent the previous weekend. Detective Nathan Sanders and his partner, Detective Maria Gonzalez, entered the sterile interview room where Mara waited, her slight frame almost lost in the oversized orange jumpsuit that marked her new status as a murder suspect. The room was sparsely furnished, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner to record the proceedings that would ultimately determine the teenager's fate. 3 days had passed since Jennifer Morrison's death, and Mara had maintained her story through initial questioning. She hadn't gone outside, hadn't touched the lighthouse statue, hadn't seen what happened to her mother. This consistency, unusual in juvenile suspects who typically broke down quickly under questioning, had impressed even veteran investigators. Now, armed with the forensic results and security footage, Sanders was prepared to methodically dismantle the facade Mara had constructed. "Mara, I want to talk to you again about what happened at the beach house," Sanders began, his tone deliberately conversational as he arranged a folder of documents on the table between them. "Before we start, I need to remind you of your rights. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights?" The teenager nodded, her face expressionless, then added a quiet "yes" when prompted for a verbal response for the recording. The facility had appointed a public defender, Melissa Rodriguez, who sat beside Mara during the interrogation, her presence required by law for a minor facing such serious charges. Rodriguez had advised her client not to speak with investigators, but Mara had insisted on talking, a decision that would prove consequential as the interrogation unfolded. "My client has agreed to answer your questions," Rodriguez stated for the record, "but I reserve the right to end this interview at any point if I feel it's not in her best interest to continue." Sanders began by establishing rapport, asking Mara about her interests, her school, her friends back home, mundane questions designed to get her talking before steering toward the events of July 14th. He noted her responses becoming increasingly terse as the conversation approached the subject of her mother, her body language shifting subtly, arms crossing, shoulders tensing, eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind him, rather than meeting his gaze directly. "Mara, in our previous conversation, you told us you didn't go outside on the deck after your mom did," Sanders said, sliding a still frame from the security footage across the table. "But this camera from the neighbor's house shows something different. Can you explain why we're seeing you follow your mother onto the deck at 6:29 p.m.? The image showed a clear silhouette of Mara approaching the deck door, unmistakable in the distinctive blue dress she had worn to the baby shower. The teenager stared at the photograph, her composed facade cracking slightly as she realized the narrative she had constructed was beginning to collapse. "Maybe I did go out for a minute," she conceded after a long pause. "I forgot. It wasn't important." This first admission, small as it was, opened the door for Sanders to methodically present the mounting evidence against her, piece by piece, in a strategy designed to make continued denial increasingly untenable. Next came the enhanced images showing Mara returning inside alone at 6:32 p.m. with no sign of Jennifer. "Your mother never came back inside, did she? And she never went for a walk on the beach like you told everyone," Sanders said, his tone still measured but more pointed now. "The camera shows no one else on that deck during those 3 minutes, Mara. Just you and your mom, and then just you coming back inside." Mara's attorney interjected, reminding her client she didn't have to answer, but Mara waved her off. "The camera angle is bad," she insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "You can't see the stairs from there? She could have gone down to the beach from the side stairs. That's what happened. She went down to the beach, and I came back inside." This elaboration on her original story would later be presented by prosecutors as evidence of Mara's calculating nature, her ability to adapt her lies when confronted with contradicting evidence rather than simply breaking down in the face of truth. Sanders allowed this explanation to stand momentarily before delivering the most damaging evidence. "We found the lighthouse statue, Mara," he said, placing photographs of the ceramic piece on the table. "The one you said you never touched. We found your fingerprints on it under the blood, your mother's blood." He laid out the forensic photos showing the enhanced fingerprint matches, the microscopic blood spatter, and the hair fragments embedded in the decorative ridges. For the first time since the interrogation began, Mara's composure visibly faltered. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the forensic images, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as they rested on the table edge. "That's not possible," she whispered, though the conviction had drained from her voice. I wouldn't. "The medical examiner determined your mother died from blunt force trauma to the head," Sanders continued, methodically building his case. "The wound pattern matches perfectly with the base of this lighthouse statue. She was struck from behind, Mara. She never saw it coming. And then, while she was already unconscious or dying, she went over the railing onto the rocks below." The teenager's attorney again tried to intervene, concerned about the direction of the questioning. But Mara leaned forward, her attention now fully fixed on the photographs of the lighthouse statue. "You cleaned it afterward, didn't you?" Sanders asked. "You tried to wash off the blood and put it back on the mantel, hoping no one would notice. But you missed spots. Blood gets into places you can't see with the naked eye, and your fingerprints were already underneath, preserved by the blood layer above them." Hours into the interrogation, with the weight of evidence mounting inexorably against her, Mara still maintained her innocence, though her denials had grown increasingly desperate and fragmented. Sanders decided to change tactics, shifting from the physical evidence to the psychological motive that had been revealed through Mara's journal entries. "We found your journal, Mara," he said quietly, placing a photocopy of several pages before her. "You wrote about feeling replaced by the baby, about thinking your parents were sending you to boarding school to get rid of you." The effect of seeing her private thoughts laid bare was immediate and profound. Mara's face flushed, her eyes darting between the journal pages and Sanders' face. "You had no right," she said, her voice cracking. "That's private. You had no right to read that." This burst of genuine emotion, the first she had displayed since her mother's death, signaled to Sanders that they had finally reached the core of the case. "Your mom and dad weren't trying to replace you," Sanders said, his tone softening slightly. "Those boarding school brochures were for schools with strong science programs like the marine biology you used to talk about wanting to study. They were trying to give you opportunities, not get rid of you." He placed copies of emails between Jennifer and the schools on the table, messages discussing scholarship applications, campus visits, and Jennifer's proud descriptions of her daughter's academic potential. This revelation that her core belief about being discarded had been a misinterpretation seemed to hit Mara with physical force. She stared at the emails, her breathing becoming ragged as the narrative she had constructed about her parents' intentions began to unravel. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, I heard them. They said they needed to make room for the baby. I heard them talking about my room." Sanders nodded, acknowledging her perception while gently introducing an alternative explanation. "Your dad told us about that conversation," he said. "They were talking about rearranging your room to make space for a desk with a new computer, a gift they were planning for you before you'd start applications for those schools. They weren't planning to give your room to the baby, Mara. The nursery was already set up in their home office. The strategic revelation of this misunderstanding, coming after hours of confrontation with physical evidence, created the breakdown point investigators had been working toward. Mara's carefully maintained facade collapsed completely as she began to sob, deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from somewhere primal within her. She wouldn't stop talking about the baby, she finally said between sobs. Every day, every minute, it was all about Ethan. What about me? What about what I needed? She was going to love that baby more than me. I just wanted her to stop talking about it. The confession, when it finally came, emerged in disjointed fragments that investigators would later piece together into a coherent narrative. Mara described watching her mother open gift after gift at the shower, each one fueling her resentment. She recounted the moment when Jennifer held up a tiny blue sweater and said, "This is perfect for family pictures next Christmas," a comment that triggered something dark inside her teenage daughter. "I couldn't breathe," Mara said, describing the moments before the murder. "Everyone was cooing over baby clothes and nobody saw me. Nobody cared that I was sitting there feeling like I was disappearing. So when Mom went outside, I grabbed the lighthouse thing from the mantel and followed her. I didn't even really think about what I was going to do. I just wanted to make her listen to me." According to confession, Jennifer had been standing at the railing, looking out at the sunset, completely unaware of her daughter's approach or the object she carried. "I called her name, and she started to turn, but not all the way," Mara recounted, her voice now hollow. "I hit her before she could see it was me. I hit her hard, and there was so much blood right away. She made this sound, then she just fell over the railing. I didn't push her. She just fell." The teenager described her actions immediately afterward with a detachment that disturbed even the seasoned investigators. She had quickly taken the lighthouse statue to the outdoor sink, rinsed it under the hose, wiped it with her dress, and replaced it on the mantel before anyone noticed either her absence or her mother's. "Then I just went back to the party," she said. "I ate cake. I helped clean up wrapping paper. I kept waiting for someone to notice something was wrong with me, but no one did." When asked about her lack of emotional response after the discovery of her mother's body, Mara's answer was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the confession. "I knew I should feel something," she said. "I knew I should be crying like Dad was, but I just felt empty. Like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. It didn't seem real that Mom was gone, that I was the one who made her gone. It still doesn't." As the hours-long interrogation concluded, Detective Sanders asked one final question that would later resonate powerfully with the jury. "Do you regret what happened to your mother and your baby brother?" Mara's response, after a long pause, was delivered without tears, in a voice that had returned to the detached calm that had characterized her behavior since the murder. "I regret that I didn't understand about the boarding schools. I regret that I thought they were trying to replace me. But I don't know if I can feel sorry yet about what happened. Is that wrong? Am I supposed to feel sorry now?" This admission of emotional detachment, combined with the calculated nature of her actions following the murder, would form the foundation for the prosecution's portrayal of Mara as a dangerously calculating individual despite her young age. The video recording of the interrogation, particularly the cold delivery of her final statement about regret, would later play a crucial role in the decision to try her as an adult for the murders of Jennifer Morrison and her unborn child. The Monroe County Courthouse in Key West, a stately Spanish colonial building with arched windows and a terracotta roof, had seen its share of high-profile cases over the decades, but none had attracted the media attention now converging on its steps. Television crews from national networks jostled for position alongside local reporters, all eager to capture footage of the unprecedented trial about to unfold within its walls. a 14-year-old girl facing adult charges for the murder of her pregnant mother. The Florida Keys, community typically more concerned with tourism and environmental issues than violent crime, found itself thrust into the national spotlight as a case that touched on primal fears about family violence captivated public attention. Inside Courtroom 3, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling, Judge Harold Mendoza's chambers had become command central for managing the extraordinary security and media concerns surrounding State of Florida versus Maura Morrison. A 30-year veteran of the bench with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, Mendoza had denied requests for cameras inside, citing the defendant's age despite her being tried as an adult. This decision had only intensified the media's determination to capture every moment outside the courtroom, with sketch artists commanding premium rates to record the proceedings for broadcast. On September 12, 2022, nearly 2 months after Jennifer Morrison's death, the trial officially began with jury selection, a process complicated by the extensive pretrial publicity the case had generated. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their exposure to media coverage, their views on trying juveniles as adults, and whether they could set aside preconceived notions about the sensational aspects of the case. After 3 days of careful vetting, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was impaneled, with 4 alternates selected due to the expected length and emotional intensity of the trial. As the courtroom settled on the first day of opening statements, the contrast between the prosecution and defense tables was striking. Prosecutor Emma Collins sat flanked by 2 assistant district attorneys and a case manager, surrounded by meticulously organized binders and digital presentation equipment. The prosecution team projected confidence and preparedness, having constructed what many legal observers considered an airtight case based on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own confession. At the defense table, Maura Morrison sat between her court-appointed attorneys, looking even younger than her 14 years in a modest navy blue dress with a white collar, an outfit carefully selected to emphasize her youth. Her father, David Morrison, was noticeably absent, having been designated as a witness for both prosecution and defense, requiring his exclusion from the courtroom until his testimony. This isolation from her only surviving parent underscored the complete rupture of the family unit that had occurred on that July evening in the Florida Keys. Judge Mendoza called the court to order precisely at 9:00 a.m., his authoritative voice filling the hushed courtroom. The State of Florida versus Maura Morrison, case number 22 CR 1475, is now in session, he announced, before addressing the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been selected to determine the facts in an extremely serious matter. The defendant, though young in years, is being tried as an adult due to the nature of the charges against her. I must remind you that your duty is to consider only the evidence presented in this courtroom, not any outside information or personal feelings about juvenile justice policies. Prosecutor Emma Collins rose for her opening statement, her tall figure commanding attention as she moved to stand directly before the jury box. On July 14, 2022, in a beach house in the Florida Keys, Jennifer Morrison was excited to celebrate the impending birth of her son. After years of heartbreaking miscarriages, she began, her voice measured but emotive. She had invited family to share in her joy, including her 14-year-old daughter, Maura, who sat silently watching as her mother opened gifts for her unborn brother. What no one at that gathering realized was that Maura Morrison had already decided that her mother and brother would never leave that beach house alive. Collins methodically outlined the prosecution's case, using a large digital screen to display a timeline of events alongside key photographs: the beach house exterior, the deck where the attack occurred, the rocky shore below where Jennifer's body was found. Conspicuously absent were any graphic images of the victim, as Collins had strategically decided to introduce these gradually during testimony to maximize their emotional impact on the jury. The evidence will show that Maura Morrison followed her mother onto the deck, armed with a decorative lighthouse statue she had taken from the mantelpiece, Collins continued, now displaying a photograph of the statue sealed in an evidence bag. With this object, she struck her unsuspecting mother from behind with such force that Jennifer Morrison was likely unconscious before she fell over the railing to the rocks below. The medical examiner will testify that Jennifer died not from the fall, but from the blunt force trauma delivered by her own daughter's hand. The prosecutor then turned to what would become the centerpiece of the state's case, the forensic evidence connecting Maura to the murder weapon. This lighthouse statue, which the defendant attempted to clean and return to its place as if nothing had happened, tells the story she tried to conceal, Collins explained, her voice growing more emphatic. It contains her fingerprints beneath layers of her mother's blood and hair, proof positive that she handled this object before it became the instrument of Jennifer Morrison's death. The laboratory technicians who analyzed this evidence will walk you through their findings in detail, showing you exactly how science has revealed the truth this young woman tried to hide. Collins then addressed the question of motive, carefully framing Maura's actions as stemming from a profound but ultimately inexcusable misinterpretation of her parents' intentions. The evidence will show that Maura Morrison had convinced herself that her parents were sending her to boarding school to make room for her baby brother, that she was being replaced and discarded, the prosecutor explained. Her own journal entries, which you will see, document this growing resentment and the distorted thinking that led to violence. But the evidence will also show that this was a tragic misunderstanding. The boarding schools her parents were considering were prestigious opportunities they were excited to offer their daughter, not a way to remove her from their lives. The most powerful moment of Collins's opening statement came when she addressed the calculated nature of Maura's actions following the murder. Ladies and gentlemen, after Maura Morrison killed her mother, she didn't panic. She didn't call for help. She didn't confess to what had happened in a moment of remorse, she said, her voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of these points. Instead, she calmly washed the murder weapon, replaced it on the mantel, returned to the baby shower, ate cake, and fabricated a story about her mother taking a walk on the beach. For nearly 2 hours, while her mother and unborn brother lay dead on the rocks below, she participated in the very celebration that had triggered her rage, showing a level of calculation and emotional detachment that belies any claim that this was a momentary, impulsive act by an immature mind. Collins concluded by directly addressing the issue of Maura's age, anticipating the defense's central argument. The defense will ask you to focus on the defendant's youth, to see her as a child incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions, she acknowledged. But the evidence will show you something different, a young person who understood exactly what she was doing when she took that lighthouse statue from the mantel, when she followed her mother onto that deck, when she struck her from behind, when she cleaned the weapon, and when she lied to everyone for 3 days afterward. The law recognizes that some crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's age, require accountability at the highest level. This is such a crime, and Maura Morrison must be held accountable for the 2 lives she deliberately extinguished. As Collins returned to her seat, the courtroom remained utterly silent, the weight of her narrative hanging in the air. Defense attorney Melissa Rodriguez then approached the jury, her presentation offering a stark contrast to the prosecution's methodical timeline. Where Collins had been commanding, Rodriguez was conversational. Where the prosecutor had emphasized calculation, the defender spoke of confusion and impulse. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you look at my client, what do you see?" Rodriguez began, gesturing toward Maura. "The prosecution wants you to see a calculating killer, a person who coldly planned and executed a murder. But I'm asking you to see what is actually sitting at that table, a 14-year-old child whose brain is literally, scientifically, years away from being fully developed, a child who misunderstood adult conversations and spiraled into fear and confusion, a child who had an emotional outburst with tragic, irreversible consequences that she never intended or foresaw. Rodriguez acknowledged the basic facts of the case but reframed them within a narrative of adolescent crisis rather than calculated malice. Mara Morrison did follow her mother onto that deck. She did pick up that lighthouse statue in a moment of overwhelming emotion. And a terrible tragedy did occur, the defender conceded. But what the prosecution characterizes as calculation after the fact, we will show was actually shock, confusion, and the desperate self-protective instincts of a child who couldn't process what had happened and didn't know how to ask for help. The defense attorney then introduced what would become their primary strategy, challenging not the physical evidence, which was largely incontrovertible, but the interpretation of Mara's mental state and intentions. Expert witnesses in adolescent psychology and brain development will explain to you that teenagers, especially those under extreme emotional distress, do not process information or make decisions the way adults do, Rodriguez explained. Their brains physically cannot engage in the kind of premeditation and calculation the prosecution alleges. What appears to adults as calculated behavior is often impulsivity followed by primitive self-preservation. Rodriguez concluded by reminding the jury of the extraordinary burden they carried in this case. The prosecution is asking you to send a 14-year-old child to prison for the rest of her life, she said, her voice softening. Before you agree to that irreversible decision, we ask that you listen to all the evidence, not just about what happened on that tragic day, but about who Mara Morrison actually is, about how the adolescent brain works, and about whether justice is truly served by treating a child as if she possessed the fully formed judgment and understanding of an adult. As the opening statements concluded, Judge Mendoza instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, setting in motion a trial that would not only determine Mara Morrison's fate, but would also become a flashpoint in national discussions about juvenile justice, family psychology, and the intersection of neuroscience and criminal responsibility. The lighthouse statue, sealed in its evidence bag on the prosecution's exhibit table, stood as a silent reminder of the central role physical evidence would play in the proceedings to come, the irrefutable link between a teenager's momentary rage and the permanent loss of 2 lives. The third day of trial brought the prosecution's most anticipated witness to the stand, Dr. Raymond Garcia, the Monroe County medical examiner who had performed Jennifer Morrison's autopsy. A veteran forensic pathologist with over 20 years of experience, Garcia had testified in dozens of murder trials, his precise, methodical explanations of technical details making him a favorite of prosecutors seeking to clarify complex medical evidence for juries. As he took the stand, his professional demeanor and white lab coat lent an air of scientific authority that commanded the courtroom's attention. Prosecutor Emma Collins established Dr. Garcia's credentials before moving directly to his findings. Doctor, in your examination of Jennifer Morrison, what did you determine to be the cause of death? She asked, beginning with the most fundamental question. Garcia adjusted his glasses and responded with clinical precision. Jennifer Morrison died as a result of blunt force trauma to the occipital region of the skull, the back of the head, causing catastrophic brain injury. While she sustained multiple additional injuries from the subsequent fall onto the rocks, the fatal injury was the initial blow to the head, which would have caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes, regardless of the fall. Collins displayed a diagram of the human skull on the courtroom's large screen, allowing Dr. Garcia to indicate the exact location and nature of the fatal wound. Can you explain to the jury how you determined that this injury occurred before the fall rather than as a result of impact with the rocks below?" she asked. The medical examiner nodded, pointing to specific patterns on the diagram. The wound had very distinct characteristics: a circular depression with a particular patterned edge that did not match any of the rocks at the scene, he explained. Additionally, the blood spatter pattern on the victim's clothing and on the deck railing indicated bleeding had begun before she went over the edge. Had she sustained the injury from falling onto the rocks, we would have seen a different pattern of blood distribution. Using carefully edited photographs that showed the wound pattern without unnecessarily graphic details, Dr. Garcia then demonstrated the lock and key match between Jennifer's skull fracture and the base of the lighthouse statue. When we compared the distinctive pattern of the wound to the base of the lighthouse statue recovered from the scene, we found a perfect correspondence, not just in size but in the specific decorative ridges that created unique impressions in the skull, he testified. In my professional opinion, this lighthouse statue is without question the instrument that delivered the fatal blow. The medical examiner then addressed a question central to the prosecution's portrayal of the crime as particularly callous: whether Jennifer would have seen the attack coming or had any chance to defend herself. Based on the angle and location of the wound, the victim was struck from behind and slightly above, consistent with someone approaching from behind while she was looking out toward the water, Garcia stated. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, which we typically see when a victim has time to perceive and react to an attack. This suggests the blow came without warning, giving Jennifer no opportunity to protect herself. Perhaps the most powerful moment of Dr. Garcia's testimony came when Collins asked about the second victim in the case. Dr. Garcia, Jennifer Morrison was 7 months pregnant at the time of her death. Can you tell the jury about your findings regarding the unborn child? The medical examiner's professional composure momentarily softened as he addressed this aspect of his examination. The male fetus, identified in medical records as Ethan Morrison, was at approximately 30 weeks gestation, well-developed, viable, and by all indications healthy, he explained. Death of the fetus occurred as a direct result of maternal death. Had Jennifer Morrison been found immediately and received medical intervention, there is a possibility the child could have been saved through emergency delivery. But given the circumstances, the delay in discovering her body and the remote location, both lives were lost as a direct result of the attack. On cross-examination, defense attorney Rodriguez attempted to introduce uncertainty into Dr. Garcia's timeline, suggesting the possibility that the fall itself could have been the primary cause of death. Dr. Garcia, isn't it possible that Jennifer Morrison was conscious after being struck, attempted to steady herself against the railing, and then accidentally fell? She asked. The medical examiner shook his head firmly. The severity of the skull fracture would have caused immediate unconsciousness, he replied. The blow was delivered with significant force, not a glancing hit, but a direct, powerful impact. Based on the evidence, my conclusion is that she was either unconscious or already dying when she went over the railing. Following the medical testimony, the prosecution called investigator Melissa Chen, the forensic technician who had first noticed the suspicious nature of the lighthouse statue at the crime scene. Chen's testimony focused on the meticulous process through which she had identified and preserved the evidence that would become central to the case against Mara. Something about the lighthouse statue immediately caught my attention, she explained to the jury. In a room where most decorative objects had a normal level of dust and fingerprint smudges consistent with regular handling, this piece appeared to have been recently and thoroughly cleaned. It had that distinctive too clean quality that forensic investigators are trained to notice as potentially suspicious. Using specialized lighting and photography, Chen demonstrated for the jury how she had detected microscopic blood spatter on the lighthouse statue despite its apparently clean surface. Blood has unique properties that make it difficult to remove completely, especially from porous materials like the ceramic of the statue, she explained. Under alternate light sources, we could see traces of blood that had seeped into tiny crevices in the decorative elements, particularly around the base and the textured rocks at the bottom of the lighthouse design. This testimony directly contradicted Mara's initial claim of never touching the statue, establishing a clear attempt at concealment that the prosecution argued demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Most damaging to the defense was Chen's explanation of the fingerprint evidence. Using specialized techniques for revealing latent prints beneath substances that have been wiped away, we were able to recover partial fingerprints from multiple locations on the statue, she testified. The sequencing of these materials is crucial to understanding what happened. Mara's fingerprints were underneath the layers of blood, proving they were deposited first before the blood contaminated the surface and before the cleaning attempt. Side-by-side comparison charts showed the distinctive match between Mara's fingerprints and those recovered from the statue, providing visual confirmation of the forensic connection. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by the testimony of Daniel Winters, the security technology expert who had enhanced and analyzed the footage from the neighboring beach house. While the camera wasn't directly pointed at the Morrisons' deck, it captured enough of the area to establish a clear timeline, Winters explained, using frame-by-frame analysis to show the jury. At 6:28 p.m., we see Jennifer Morrison step onto the deck alone. At 6:29 p.m., approximately 1 minute later, we see Mara Morrison follow her mother outside. At 6:32 p.m., we see only Mara returning inside, closing the door behind her. Jennifer Morrison is never seen on the footage again, and no other individuals appear on the deck during this time window. When the prosecution called David Morrison to the stand on the trial's fifth day, the courtroom fell completely silent. Jennifer's husband and Mara's father entered slowly, the physical toll of the tragedy evident in his stooped posture and prematurely grayed hair. As he took the oath, his eyes briefly met his daughter's across the courtroom, their first face-to-face encounter since her arrest nearly 2 months earlier. The momentary connection captured by courtroom sketch artists in pastels that would appear in newspapers nationwide conveyed a complexity of emotion that transcended the adversarial nature of the proceedings. Collins approached David's testimony with careful sensitivity, allowing him time to compose himself when emotions threatened to overwhelm his responses. "Mr. Morrison, can you tell the jury about the boarding school brochures that were found in your home office?" she asked, directly addressing the misunderstanding that had allegedly triggered Mara's violent response. David nodded, his voice steadying as he explained. "Jennifer and I had noticed Mara seeming increasingly unhappy at her current school. Her grades were slipping, and she wasn't connecting with friends the way she used to. We thought a change of environment might help, somewhere with strong science programs, since Mara had always loved marine biology, just like I did at her age." The father's testimony directly contradicted the narrative Mara had constructed about being sent away to make room for the baby. "We were looking at schools that would nurture her interests and help prepare her for college," he continued, emotion cracking through his composed facade. "It was never about getting rid of her. It was about giving her opportunities. We were so proud of her, so excited about her future. The idea that she thought we were replacing her with the baby." His voice broke completely then, unable to finish the sentence. When asked about the conversation Mara had apparently overheard about making room for the baby, David provided the devastating clarification. "We were talking about rearranging Mara's room to make space for a new computer desk and equipment," he explained. "It was going to be a surprise, a setup for her to work on school applications and marine biology projects. The nursery was already finished. We'd converted the home office months earlier. We would never have taken Mara's room for the baby. That was her space. The most wrenching moment of David's testimony came when Collins asked him about finding Jennifer's body. As he recounted the moments of discovering his wife on the rocks below the deck, his composure finally shattered completely. "I knew immediately she was gone," he said through tears. "The way she was lying there, I called her name anyway. I kept calling her name. And the whole time, I had no idea that my own daughter—" He couldn't continue, and Judge Mendoza called a brief recess to allow the witness to compose himself. When testimony resumed, Collins introduced what would become one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the case, Jennifer's journal, found in her luggage at the beach house. David identified his wife's handwriting, and Collins asked him to read the entry dated the night before the murder. His voice shaking, he read Jennifer's words expressing excitement about the baby shower, alongside her concern about Mara's withdrawal and apparent misunderstanding about the boarding school discussions. The final lines, "I hope she understands this baby isn't replacing her. There's room in our hearts for both our children," left many in the courtroom, including several jurors, visibly moved. The defense team faced the daunting challenge of countering this powerful testimony without appearing to attack a grieving father or dismiss the overwhelming physical evidence. Their strategy focused on contextualizing rather than disputing the central facts, calling expert witnesses who specialized in adolescent brain development and psychology to explain how a teenager might misinterpret parental actions and respond with disproportionate emotion. Dr. Sarah Levine, a neuropsychologist specializing in adolescent development, provided testimony about the still-developing prefrontal cortex in teenage brains, the region of the brain responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding long-term consequences isn't fully matured until the mid-20s, Dr. Levine explained. This isn't a moral failing or a choice, it's biology. Adolescents, particularly under emotional stress, simply don't process information or make decisions the way adults do. The defense also called Dr. Marcus Hoffman, a child psychologist who had evaluated Mara during her pretrial detention. "What I observed was consistent with a phenomenon called catastrophic thinking, common in adolescents dealing with family changes," Dr. Hoffman testified. Mara had constructed a narrative where her parents' actions, discussions of boarding school, excitement about the new baby, were interpreted through a lens of abandonment and replacement. Once this narrative took hold, everything she observed was filtered through it, reinforcing her distorted belief system until it became her reality. The prosecution challenged these expert witnesses during cross-examination, with Collins repeatedly emphasizing the distinction between typical teenage impulsivity and Mara's apparently calculated actions following the murder. Dr. Hoffman, does the undeveloped adolescent brain you've described explain not just a moment of violent impulse, but the methodical cleaning of the murder weapon, the return to the party as if nothing had happened, and the maintenance of a false story? For 3 days afterward, she asked pointedly. The psychologist acknowledged that such sustained deception was unusual, even for adolescents, though he maintained that shock and self-preservation instincts could account for some of the behavior. As the evidentiary phase of the trial neared its conclusion, Judge Mendoza made the controversial decision to allow portions of Mara's videotaped confession to be played for the jury, over defense objections about the psychological pressure applied during the lengthy interrogation. The selected segments showed Mara's transition from denial to admission, culminating in her chilling statement, "She was going to love that baby more than me. I just wanted her to stop talking about it." Her effect in the video, flat, detached, almost eerily calm, even while describing the violent act, made a visible impression on the jury, several of whom appeared disturbed by the disconnect between the emotional content of her words and her delivery. The final testimony in the case came from Alexandra Bennett, Jennifer's sister and Mara's aunt, called by the defense in an attempt to humanize the teenager before deliberations began. Alexandra spoke of Mara's early childhood, her curiosity, her affection for animals, her close relationship with her mother before the pregnancy. She was always such a sensitive child, Alexandra testified, wiping tears. She felt things so deeply. When Jennifer had her miscarriages, Mara would make these little memorial drawings for the babies they lost. She used to say she was saving up all her sister skills for when she finally got a sibling. This poignant glimpse into Mara's earlier character created a stark contrast with the emotionally detached teenager now sitting at the defense table, underscoring for the jury the profound psychological disconnection that had occurred. As testimony concluded and the case moved toward closing arguments, the competing narratives had crystallized around a central question. Was Mara Morrison's act one of premeditated malice driven by jealousy and resentment? Or was it the impulsive reaction of an immature brain unable to process complex emotions and misunderstanding parental intentions? The answer would determine not just her legal fate, but would reflect society's broader struggle with questions of juvenile culpability, brain development, and the appropriate balance between rehabilitation and punishment in cases of extreme violence committed by the very young. The Monroe County Courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of closing arguments. The corridors packed with media personnel, legal observers, and community members who had followed the case with growing investment over the 2-week trial. Outside, satellite trucks lined the palm-fringed streets of Key West, their antennas reaching skyward like technological sentinels broadcasting this island community's tragedy to a captivated national audience. The Florida Keys, accustomed to being featured in travel segments about sunsets and sport fishing, now found itself the reluctant backdrop for a case that touched on universal anxieties about family dynamics and the darkness that can lurk within seemingly normal homes. Inside Courtroom 3, the gallery had filled to capacity an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. Court officers maintained strict order, aware that the emotional intensity of the case had drawn spectators with strong opinions on both sides. Some attendees wore small blue ribbons, a symbol adopted by Jennifer's former colleagues at Marathon Elementary, to honor her memory and that of her unborn son. Others carried signs supporting juvenile justice reform, though these had been confiscated at the courthouse entrance, Judge Mendoza having prohibited any displays that might influence the jury. As prosecutor Emma Collins rose for her closing argument, the courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the ceiling fans could be heard creaking overhead. Collins approached the jury deliberately, her demeanor reflecting the gravity of the decision before them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "over the past 2 weeks, you have heard testimony and seen evidence that tells the story of a calculated act of violence that ended 2 innocent lives, Jennifer Morrison and her unborn son, Ethan. The defense has asked you to focus on the defendant's youth, on brain development, on misunderstandings. But let us not lose sight of what the evidence has clearly established." Collins methodically recapped the physical evidence: the lighthouse statue with Mara's fingerprints beneath her mother's blood, the security footage showing her following Jennifer onto the deck and returning alone, the medical examiner's testimony about the fatal blow delivered from behind without warning. "These are not matters of interpretation or psychology," she emphasized. "These are facts established through science and observation. They tell us what happened on that deck, even though only one person who was present is still alive to speak about it." The prosecutor then addressed the central claim of the defense, that Mara's age and developing brain explained her actions. "Youth is not a license to kill," Collins stated firmly. "The law recognizes that some actions are so extreme, so clearly wrong, that even young people must be held fully accountable for them." Mara Morrison didn't lash out in a momentary loss of control. She followed her mother onto that deck, carrying a weapon. She struck her from behind, giving her no chance to defend herself. Then, most tellingly, she cleaned the murder weapon, returned to the party, and maintained a fabricated story for 3 days. Collins projected a timeline on the courtroom screen, highlighting the nearly 2-hour period between the murder and the discovery of Jennifer's body. During this time, while her mother and unborn brother lay dead on the rocks, Mara Morrison ate cake, helped clean up wrapping paper, and calmly told family members that her mother had gone for a walk on the beach, she emphasized. This is not the impulsive behavior of an undeveloped brain. This is the calculated deception of someone who understood exactly what she had done and was taking deliberate steps to avoid the consequences. The prosecutor concluded by reminding the jury of their duty to the victims. Jennifer Morrison will never see her son grow up. Ethan Morrison will never draw a breath. David Morrison has lost his wife, his unborn child, and in a very real sense, his daughter as well. They deserve justice. The evidence has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that Mara Morrison committed first-degree murder, and it is your duty to return that verdict, regardless of how difficult that may be given her age. Defense attorney Melissa Rodriguez approached the jury with a markedly different energy, her manner conversational and empathetic, rather than prosecutorial. When this trial began, I asked you to see what is actually sitting at the defense table, not the calculating killer the prosecution has described, but a 14-year-old child whose brain is literally, scientifically, years away from being fully developed, she began. Everything we've heard in this courtroom confirms that reality. Rodriguez acknowledged the tragedy of Jennifer's death, but reframed Mara's actions as the result of a profound misunderstanding escalated by adolescent catastrophic thinking. Mara believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that her parents were replacing her, sending her away to make room for a new child they would love more, the defender explained. We now know this wasn't true, but to Mara's developing brain, filtering everything through the lens of teenage insecurity and fear of abandonment, it was reality. The defense attorney referenced the expert testimony about adolescent brain development, reminding jurors that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding consequences, is physiologically immature in teenagers. This isn't an excuse, it's biology, she emphasized. When Mara followed her mother onto that deck, she was experiencing emotions no 14-year-old is equipped to process rationally. The result was tragedy, a split-second action with irreversible consequences that she neither intended nor fully comprehended. Rodriguez directly challenged the prosecution's characterization of Mara's behavior after the murder as calculated deception. What the prosecution calls calculation, psychology recognizes as the primitive self-preservation instincts of a brain in shock, she argued. Mara didn't process what had happened. She didn't know how to ask for help. She retreated into denial and disassociation, psychological mechanisms well documented in adolescents facing trauma too overwhelming to integrate. The defense's closing argument culminated in a direct appeal to the jury's sense of proportionality and justice. The prosecution is asking you to send a 14-year-old child to prison for the rest of her life, Rodriguez stated solemnly. Before you make that irrevocable decision, I ask you to consider whether true justice is served by treating a child's tragic mistake, born of misunderstanding, fueled by immature brain development, and resulting in consequences she never intended, the same way we would treat a calculating adult murderer. Is society truly protected by throwing away the key on a 14-year-old life? Or is there room in our justice system for both accountability and recognition of the fundamental differences between adolescent and adult minds? After the closing arguments, Judge Mendoza delivered his instructions to the jury, carefully explaining the legal elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter under Florida law. He emphasized that while Mara was being tried as an adult, her age could be considered as a mitigating factor in determining whether she had the capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. These instructions, crafted after lengthy arguments from both legal teams, attempted to balance the competing considerations of youth and culpability that had defined the case. The jury began deliberations at 2:17 p.m. on Friday, September 23rd, retiring to a wood-paneled room where the evidence had been assembled for their review. Court observers had anticipated lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the case and the emotional weight of deciding a juvenile's fate. Many were surprised when the jury buzzed to signal they had reached a verdict after just 4 hours of discussion, a remarkably short time for a case of this magnitude. As the jurors filed back into the courtroom at 6:42 p.m., their faces revealed nothing of their decision. The foreman, a middle-aged high school teacher, handed the sealed verdict form to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Mendoza. The judge reviewed the document impassively before returning it to the clerk for reading. Throughout the courtroom, breaths were held as the moment of resolution approached. In the case of State of Florida versus Mara Morrison, on the count of murder in the first degree of Jennifer Morrison, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged, the clerk read, her voice steady but quieter than usual in the silent courtroom. On the count of murder in the first degree of unborn child Ethan Morrison, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. The gallery remained eerily silent as the verdict was announced, the absence of the typical gasps or murmurs, reflecting perhaps the sad inevitability many had felt as the evidence mounted during trial. At the defense table, Mara Morrison sat completely still, her expression unchanged from the blank affect she had maintained throughout much of the proceedings. It was only when the judge thanked and dismissed the jury that a subtle shift occurred, a slight widening of her eyes, a barely perceptible trembling of her hands resting on the table before her, suggesting that despite her outward composure, some part of her had held on to hope for a different outcome. David Morrison, seated in the front row behind the prosecution table, where he had watched the closing arguments after completing his testimony, buried his face in his hands at the announcement of the verdict. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as Jennifer's sister Alexandra embraced him, their shared grief transcending the adversarial nature of the proceedings that had forced him to effectively choose between justice for his wife and mercy for his daughter. The impossible position of the surviving parent caught between the murdered and the murderer had been a subtext throughout the trial, and it found its most poignant expression in this moment of a legal resolution that could offer no true healing. Judge Mendoza set sentencing for October 5th, remanding Mara to juvenile detention until that date, despite her conviction as an adult. As she was led from the courtroom by deputies, Mara turned slightly toward her father, perhaps seeking some final connection. But David remained bent forward in his grief, unable to meet her gaze. This missed moment of potential reconciliation, noted by several courtroom observers, would later be described in media accounts as emblematic of the case's fundamental tragedy, the complete fracturing of a family unit that could never be restored, regardless of the legal outcome. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Emma Collins delivered brief remarks to the assembled media, striking a somber rather than triumphant tone, despite her successful prosecution. Today's verdict brings legal closure to a case that has no emotional closure for those involved, she stated. While we believe justice has been served in accordance with the law and the evidence, we recognize that no verdict can undo the tragic losses suffered by all parties in this case. Our thoughts remain with David Morrison, who has endured an unimaginable family tragedy. Defense attorney Rodriguez, visibly disappointed but composed, announced their intention to appeal the verdict based on several legal grounds, including the decision to try Mara as an adult and certain evidentiary rulings during the trial. We respect the jury's service but believe this verdict reflects a fundamental flaw in how our justice system handles juvenile offenders, she told reporters. A 14-year-old's actions, however tragic the consequences, should not result in the effective destruction of yet another life through adult incarceration. We will continue to fight for a more proportionate resolution that recognizes both the tragedy that occurred and the neurological reality of adolescent development. As news of the verdict spread through the Florida Keys community, reactions were mixed but subdued. At Marathon Elementary, where Jennifer had taught, a small memorial gathering formed spontaneously on the playground she had helped design. Teachers and parents placed flowers beneath a tree planted in her memory, many expressing relief at the legal resolution while acknowledging the complexity of sentencing a 14-year-old. In the online sphere, the case had already sparked intense debate about juvenile justice, with hashtags both supporting and condemning the verdict trending nationally within hours of its announcement. For the jurors, their civic duty complete, but the weight of their decision still fresh, the evening brought private reflection rather than public commentary. Several were observed leaving the courthouse in tears, having fulfilled their legal obligation at significant emotional cost. The jury foreman, approached by reporters seeking insight into the deliberation process, offered only a brief statement. "We followed the law and the evidence as instructed by the judge. Beyond that, I think everyone involved deserves privacy as they process the outcome of this incredibly sad case." As night fell over the Florida Keys, the courthouse stood dark and empty, its role in the Morrison family tragedy complete for now. The legal system had rendered its judgment, finding Mara Morrison fully culpable for the deaths of her mother and unborn brother despite her youth. Yet as the case moved toward sentencing, questions lingered about how justice should be balanced with mercy when the perpetrator is a child, about what rehabilitation might look like for a teenager who had committed such a profound act of violence, and about whether any legal resolution could truly address the psychological complexities that had turned a family celebration into an enduring nightmare. October 5, 2022, dawned clear and unnaturally still in Key West, the usual morning bustle of the tourist town subdued in anticipation of the sentencing hearing that had drawn national media back to the steps of the Monroe County Courthouse. Inside Courtroom 3, the atmosphere was tense as security personnel conducted thorough checks of everyone entering, mindful of the emotional volatility surrounding a case involving a juvenile defendant facing potential lifetime incarceration. The wooden benches of the gallery filled with legal observers, journalists, and community members who had followed the case from its shocking beginning to this moment of formal resolution. Mara Morrison entered the courtroom in a light gray dress that emphasized her youth and small stature, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look even younger than her 14 years. The 2 weeks since her conviction had left visible marks, darker circles under her eyes, a pronounced pallor to her skin, suggesting sleep had been elusive in the juvenile detention center where she awaited her fate. She was flanked by her defense team, who had worked through the intervening period preparing sentencing arguments and beginning the groundwork for the appeals they had already announced would follow. David Morrison sat in the front row of the gallery, his face drawn and aged beyond the few months that had passed since his family's destruction. Unlike during the trial, he now made direct eye contact with his daughter as she entered, a momentary connection that courthouse observers described as carrying neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but rather a complex recognition of their shared tragedy from opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Beside him sat a victim advocate who had been working with him since Jennifer's death, ready to support him through this final formal confrontation with the legal consequences of his daughter's actions. Judge Harold Mendoza called the court to order precisely at 9:00 a.m., his authoritative voice carrying the weight of 3 decades on the bench. This court is now in session for the sentencing of Maura Morrison, case number 22 CR 1475, he announced, before addressing the procedural aspects of the hearing. Having been convicted by a jury of her peers on 2 counts of first-degree murder, the defendant appears today for sentencing. Before the court renders its decision, we will hear impact statements from those affected by these crimes and arguments from both the prosecution and defense regarding appropriate sentencing. The first impact statement came from David Morrison, who approached the podium slowly, unfolding a handwritten statement that trembled slightly in his hands. "I stand here today as someone who has lost everything," he began, his voice initially unsteady but gaining strength as he continued. "My wife, Jennifer, was the center of our family, our home, our future. After years of heartbreak and loss, we were finally going to welcome our son, Ethan, a little boy we had dreamed of and fought for through multiple miscarriages and fertility treatments. In a single moment of violence, both were taken from me forever." David paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure as he turned slightly toward his daughter. "I also lost you, Maura, the daughter I raised, the child I loved from the moment you were born. She disappeared that day, too. I don't recognize the person who could do this, who could hurt her mother and brother this way, who could return to a party and eat cake while they lay dying on the rocks below." His words hung in the courtroom, the raw honesty of his grief creating a palpable tension that even the most seasoned legal professionals found difficult to witness. "I have tried to understand," David continued after collecting himself. "I've read about adolescent brain development, about misunderstandings and impulsivity. I've tortured myself wondering if I missed signs, if I failed to see how deeply you were hurting. But understanding why doesn't change what happened or bring Jennifer and Ethan back to us." He folded his statement, having apparently decided to depart from his prepared remarks, and addressed his final words directly to Maura rather than the judge. "Whatever happens today, whatever sentence is imposed, I hope someday you truly understand what was lost, not just for me, but for you. They loved you, Maura. We both did. We always will, even now." Following David's statement, the court heard from Jennifer's sister, Alexandra, who spoke of the void left in the extended family and the elementary school community where Jennifer had taught. She described the ongoing trauma of Jennifer's students, some too young to fully comprehend why their beloved teacher had disappeared, and the memorial garden the school had created where children now learned about marine life in honor of the science curriculum Jennifer had developed. Alexandra's testimony provided a broader perspective on the ripple effects of the murder, extending the circle of impact beyond the immediate family to encompass the wider community of the Florida Keys. When it came time for defense arguments regarding sentencing, Maura's attorney Melissa Rodriguez approached the bench with a 3-pronged strategy focusing on her client's age, potential for rehabilitation, and the evolving legal standards regarding juvenile sentencing. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that juvenile offenders are fundamentally different from adults in ways that diminish their culpability and heighten their capacity for change," Rodriguez began. "The science is clear. Adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control, risk, assessment, and understanding of long-term consequences." Rodriguez presented the court with a comprehensive rehabilitation plan developed in consultation with juvenile justice experts and psychologists specializing in adolescent trauma. The plan proposed a blended sentence that would keep Maura in juvenile facilities until age 21, followed by transfer to adult supervision with regular review hearings to assess her progress and rehabilitation. This approach balances the serious nature of the offense with the recognition that a 14-year-old has unprecedented capacity for neurological development and genuine change, the attorney argued. It would provide intensive therapeutic intervention during the critical developmental years while maintaining appropriate supervision and accountability into adulthood. Prosecutor Emma Collins countered with a forceful argument for the maximum sentence permitted under Florida law. The defendant has been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, premeditated killings that demonstrated planning, execution, and calculated efforts to conceal her crimes, Collins stated. While we acknowledge her chronological age, her actions displayed a level of calculation that cannot be dismissed merely as adolescent impulsivity. Jennifer Morrison and her unborn son Ethan had their entire futures stolen from them in an act of profound selfishness and cruelty. Justice demands a sentence that reflects the permanence of that loss. Collins specifically addressed the rehabilitation plan proposed by the defense, arguing that its structured reviews and potential for early release would fail to provide the closure and assurance of justice that the victim's family deserved. David Morrison has already lost his wife and unborn son, she emphasized. He should not have to relive this trauma repeatedly through years of hearings where his daughter's release is repeatedly considered. The finality of a life sentence provides at least some measure of closure in an otherwise unresolvable tragedy. Before announcing his decision, Judge Mendoza offered Mara the opportunity to address the court, a standard procedure that many had not expected her to accept, given her limited emotional affect throughout the trial. To the surprise of many present, she rose slowly from the defense table, approaching the podium with small, hesitant steps. For the first time since her arrest, she appeared visibly nervous, her typically blank expression replaced by uncertainty as she faced the judge. "I don't know what to say," Mara began, her voice so soft that many in the courtroom leaned forward to hear. "Everyone keeps asking if I'm sorry, if I feel bad about what happened. I know I'm supposed to. I know that's what normal people would feel." She paused, seeming to struggle with articulating thoughts that remained elusive even to her. "I didn't think they loved me anymore. I thought they were replacing me with the baby. When I heard them talking about boarding school, about making room, I felt like I was disappearing, like I didn't matter." Her statement, delivered in disjointed fragments rather than the rehearsed remorse often heard at sentencings, struck many observers as a raw window into her psychological state. "When I hit her, I wasn't thinking about killing her," Mara continued. "I just wanted her to stop being so happy about the baby, to notice me again. But then there was so much blood, and she fell over the railing, and I didn't know what to do. So I cleaned the lighthouse and went back to the party because I didn't know what else to do." Mara looked directly at her father for the first time since entering her statement. "Dad said you both loved me. Maybe you did. I don't know anymore what was real and what I made up in my head. The doctors here say I have trouble processing emotions correctly, that I might have had something wrong with me even before what happened." She turned back to the judge, her final words delivered with the same detached quality that had characterized much of her behavior throughout the case. "I can't feel sorry the way I'm supposed to. I can't cry like everyone else. But I do know that everything is broken now, and it can't be fixed, and that's because of what I did." Judge Mendoza sat silently for several moments after Mara returned to her seat, the courtroom absolutely still as he considered all that had been presented. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the historic and precedential nature of the decision before him. "The court has carefully considered the jury's verdict, the impact statements, the arguments of counsel, the defendant's statement, and all relevant factors in determining an appropriate sentence for these crimes," he began. "This case presents one of the most difficult sentencing challenges I have faced in my 30 years on the bench, balancing the heinous nature of the offense with the youth of the offender and evolving standards regarding juvenile justice." The judge methodically reviewed the facts established at trial, the premeditated nature of the attack, the calculated attempt to conceal evidence afterward, and the devastating impact on both the immediate family and broader community. He acknowledged the scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development presented by the defense, but noted that the law still required accountability for actions of extreme violence, regardless of the perpetrator's age. While neuroscience helps us understand the biological limitations of the teenage brain, it does not negate the basic moral understanding that taking a human life, let alone two, is profoundly wrong, he stated. Mendoza then addressed the rehabilitation plan proposed by the defense. The court appreciates the thoughtful approach to potential rehabilitation outlined by counsel, he acknowledged. However, the dual murders in this case, committed with premeditation and followed by calculated efforts to escape responsibility, demand a response that prioritizes public safety and the finality of justice for the victims. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully, conscious of their impact not just on the case before him, but on the ongoing national conversation about juvenile justice. Mara Morrison, please rise for sentencing, Judge Mendoza instructed, his tone shifting from deliberative to declarative as he prepared to render his decision. The teenager stood alongside her attorneys, her small frame dwarfed by the massive wooden bench from which judgment would be pronounced. Having been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and having considered all factors relevant to sentencing, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count, to be served concurrently. The judge leaned forward, his next words delivered with an intensity that would be quoted in media accounts nationwide. You will never leave prison. The nature of your crimes, the lives you have taken, and the calculated manner in which you attempted to conceal your actions leave this court no alternative but to impose the maximum sentence permitted by law. While your age has been considered as a mitigating factor, it cannot outweigh the deliberate taking of 2 innocent lives, your mother and your unborn brother, in an act of violence that has permanently shattered your family and deeply affected this community. As the sentence was pronounced, Mara's expression remained largely unchanged, though observers noted a slight widening of her eyes, perhaps the first true recognition of the permanence of the consequences she faced. David Morrison, who had remained stoically composed through most of the hearing, visibly flinched at the judge's emphatic declaration, the finality of the sentence seeming to land as yet another loss in a series of devastating blows to what had once been his family. Defense attorney Rodriguez immediately announced her intention to appeal both the verdict and the sentence, citing evolving Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile life sentences without parole. This sentence violates both constitutional standards and human decency, she stated for the record. We will pursue every available avenue to ensure that this child receives a sentence that recognizes both the gravity of her actions and her capacity for rehabilitation and change. The judge acknowledged the defense's position and formally concluded the proceedings, bringing the trial phase of the Morrison case to its official close. As Mara was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her father rose from his seat as if to approach her, then hesitated, caught in the impossible space between grief for his wife and unborn son and the instinctive parental concern for his daughter, regardless of her crimes. This moment of suspended motion, David neither advancing toward nor turning away from. Mara captured the unresolvable tension at the heart of the case better than any legal argument had managed to do. Both victims and perpetrator were his family, and no court verdict could heal that fundamental wound. The aftermath of the Morrison case extended far beyond the courtroom and the lives of those directly involved. The Florida Keys community, still processing the shock of such violence occurring in their midst, established the Jennifer and Ethan Morrison Foundation for Family Communication, dedicated to creating resources for parents and teenagers struggling with family transitions and emotional regulation. The foundation, funded initially through donations from Jennifer's colleagues and community members, developed programs specifically aimed at helping adolescents articulate feelings of displacement or abandonment before they could escalate into crisis. At Marathon Elementary School, where Jennifer had taught, the Memorial Garden became a living laboratory where her teaching legacy continued through hands-on science education. Students tended native plants, monitored visiting wildlife, and learned about the marine ecosystems Jennifer had been so passionate about preserving. The school also established an annual scholarship in her name for a graduating high school senior pursuing education or marine science studies, ensuring that her influence would continue to shape young minds for generations to come. For David Morrison, the aftermath brought impossible choices about how to move forward with his life. Unable to face returning to the family home filled with memories of Jennifer and preparations for Ethan, he eventually sold the house and relocated to the mainland, seeking anonymity away from the community where the tragedy had unfolded. Colleagues reported that he had taken an extended leave from his marine biology research position, eventually transitioning to writing technical materials rather than continuing field work that had once been his passion. The most difficult decisions he faced involved his relationship with Mara. Despite the horror of her actions, she remained legally his daughter, and the question of whether to maintain contact became a private struggle that those close to him described as all-consuming in the months following sentencing. Court records would later show that he initially declined to visit her at the juvenile holding facility where she was temporarily housed before transfer to adult prison, but began writing letters 6 months after sentencing, brief, factual communications that neither offered forgiveness nor expressed condemnation, but maintained the most tenuous thread of connection. Legal experts across the country cited the Morrison case in ongoing debates about juvenile justice reform, with advocates on both sides using the case to bolster their arguments. Those favoring rehabilitation pointed to Mara's age and the neurological evidence regarding adolescent brain development, arguing that even in cases of extreme violence, juveniles deserve sentences that recognize their capacity for change. Those supporting tougher sentencing highlighted the calculated nature of Mara's actions and her apparent lack of remorse, arguing that some crimes are so heinous that age cannot mitigate the need for permanent separation from society. The appeals process began immediately, with Rodriguez filing motions challenging both the decision to try Mara as an adult and the constitutionality of life without parole for a 14-year-old offender. The appellate briefs cited recent Supreme Court precedents limiting juvenile life sentences and argued that Mara's case represented precisely the kind of disproportionate punishment the High Court had sought to prevent. Legal observers predicted a protracted battle that might eventually reach the Supreme Court as part of the ongoing national reconsideration of juvenile sentencing practices. As the legal process continued in the appellate courts, Mara Morrison was transferred to the Florida Correctional Institution for Women, where she became one of the youngest inmates in the adult prison system. Prison officials created a specialized placement for her, recognizing both the security concerns related to her age and the high-profile nature of her case. Reports from those involved in her incarceration described her as a compliant but isolated prisoner who participated in required educational programs but remained emotionally detached from both staff and other inmates. The prison's psychological services department developed a long-term treatment plan focused on addressing what had been diagnosed as a significant attachment disorder and emotional processing deficits that predated the crime. Early progress reports suggested minimal therapeutic advancement, with Mara continuing to display the flat affect and emotional disconnection that had characterized her court appearances. Whether this represented an entrenched personality disorder or a defensive psychological mechanism developed in response to her actions and subsequent imprisonment remained a subject of debate among the professionals monitoring her case. Public interest in the Morrison case eventually waned as new tragedies captured national attention, but in the Florida Keys, the impact remained palpable years after the sentencing. Local teens reported their parents becoming more attentive to signs of emotional distress, more careful about discussing family changes, more deliberate in ensuring children felt secure in their place within the family unit. School counselors noted increased referrals for students showing signs of withdrawal or resentment, as parents and teachers became hypervigilant about emotional warning signs that might once have been dismissed as typical teenage mood swings. Perhaps the most profound and lasting legacy of the Morrison case was the impossible questions it left unanswered. Questions about the nature of justice when the perpetrator is a child, about the capacity for rehabilitation even after the most extreme violence, about the possibility of forgiveness within families shattered by internal tragedy. These questions extended beyond the specific circumstances of Mara's crime to touch on fundamental societal concerns about how we understand and respond to juvenile violence, how we balance accountability with the recognition of developmental limitations, and how we make space for the possibility of redemption even in cases that seem beyond moral repair. 3 years after the sentencing, as Mara's appeals continued to work their way through the legal system, David Morrison published a brief memoir titled Both My Children, a reflection on grief, parenthood, and the impossible position of loving both the murdered and the murderer. The slim volume, written with remarkable compassion and absence of sensationalism, became required reading in criminal justice and psychology programs nationwide, offering no easy answers, but a profound meditation on the complexity of human emotion in the face of incomprehensible family violence. In the final pages of his memoir, David addressed the question he had been asked most frequently since his daughter's sentencing: whether he could ever forgive her for taking his wife and unborn son. His response captured the unresolvable nature of the tragedy better than any court document or news report had managed to do. Forgiveness implies an endpoint, a resolution, a closing of the circle. What I have learned is that some circles remain broken. I continue to love the daughter I raised, even as I struggle to understand the person she became in that moment on the deck. I continue to grieve for Jennifer and Ethan, for the future we planned that will never come to pass. These are not opposite feelings. They are the same wound viewed from different angles. I don't know if forgiveness is possible or even the right question to ask. What I do know is that carrying both love and grief, both anger and compassion, is the burden I will bear for the rest of my life. It is, perhaps, the only way to honor all 3 of my family members, the 2 who were taken and the 1 who took them.